It's become pretty clear to me that the Victorian Government holds itself to a completely different standard that businesses in this state are expected to meet. After passing strict workplace manslaughter laws, which basically hold any business owner fully liable for the death of an employee, the government's own cock-ups in hotel quarantine led to the deaths of several hundred Victorians, to such an extent that our occupational health and safety body, WorkSafe, is now suing the health department for its role in that quarantine disaster, which will probably result in no humans being held responsible, but possibly a rather large fine payable from one government department to another. I mean, thank Christ for justice. And then, over the last 18 months, we had a government handbrake applied to virtually all non-government activity, decimating main streets and killing many of the same businesses that keep our state bureaucrats in a job. The same bureaucrats who, if they weren't given massive pay rises by the Andrews government, were given full pay whilst those same essential government services were put on hold. And now we have vaccine mandates, where the state government has forced every tiny retailer, any coffee shop, to demand your vaccine status if you're to enter the shop, even though you probably stood next to them in the queue at Safeway. But rather than pay some more bureaucrats to be their health enforcers, they've decided that this massive burden should fall on our lowest paid and frontline workers, many of whom are children in their first line of paid employment. The obvious problems a policy like this has caused have now become so bad that everyone from the Australian Retailers Association to university epidemiologists are now calling for an end to the vaccine segregation in mid-December, which is the same time that New South Wales lockouts end. From The Age today, customers have been increasingly aggressive toward retail staff who have had to enforce vaccine mandates as part of Victoria's most recent relaxation of COVID-19 restrictions, which blindsided workplaces after they were given just a few hours of notice. A hot cup of coffee was thrown over a worker in one instance, reported to the Australian Retailers Association, prompting Chief Executive Paul Zara to write an open letter to Premier Daniel Andrews. He expressed concern about rising customer aggression and asked for an end to the mandates. Our members have reported thousands of incidences of customer aggression, including many acts of significant violence towards retail staff, such as staff being beaten up, an instance of a boiling cup of coffee being thrown over a frontline worker, and a shopping trolley being thrown at another, Mr. Zara said. In a push to temper the violence, Mr. Zara urged the Victorian Government to end vaccine mandates for shoppers from December 15th, which is in line with New South Wales. However, the government has ruled this out. Some of the country's leading epidemiologists have also called for the rules to ease, but Attorney General Jacqueline Symes said on Wednesday the requirements would not be relaxed. "This is our pathway out of lockdown. This is our pathway to staying open," she said. Now that's because your government, Jacqueline Symes, has said so. You could just as easily have said something like, if you've had the vaccine and maybe even a booster shot, you've done everything you can to protect yourself from COVID-19. You cannot live the rest of your life in terror and hatred of people who might be unvaccinated. And if you really are that scared, you should probably wear an N95 mask when you leave the house, or just don't go out at all. That's always been an option. There is no fundamental right that you have in Western society to never get sick. It does not exist. There are exceptions to that, like people who are aware that they have a certain STD knowingly passing it on. But you don't have the right to sue someone you brushed past at the shops for passing on a virus for which they were asymptomatic. And the government doesn't, or in this case shouldn't, have the right to lock people up in quarantine just on the off chance that they might get sick later, which is happening right now in the Northern Territory. That's right, we're back to pulling Aboriginal people out of their remote communities and, in this case, housing them in Howard Springs, purely for being a close contact of someone who has actually tested positive, which is just messed up. And frankly, it shows a government, and the Territory government's certainly not alone here, addicted to the politics of fear and hatred. More than half of the comments in the Age newspaper these days are about how the government should do more to make the lives of unvaccinated people harder, make their lives basically not worth living until they finally succumb to what the government wants them to do. Back to the article. Last week, Mr Andrews announced restrictions would be wound back as the state neared its target of fully vaccinating 90% of residents aged 12 and over, which is a massive percentage of the population. We should be proud of that. We're as protected as we can be. But the government also brought forward vaccination requirements of staff and customers from the scheduled end date of November 26. Mr Zara said the changes were made without any warning, leaving non-essential retailers blindsided. Now, due to a quirk in the state's roadmap, unvaccinated people could enter retail outlets after the 80% vaccine threshold, but were banned at 90%, which makes perfect sense. And last week's snap announcement meant they were shut out a week earlier than forecast on the roadmap. The timing, the stop-start nature of the vaccine checking requirement, following freedoms experienced by those unvaccinated Victorians, has been extremely challenging for retailers to manage, Mr Zara wrote. He said customer aggression over the past week has been worse than at any other time in the pandemic, even the toilet paper years, with incidents reported in a variety of retailers, including department stores, hardware and charity shops, some of which saw the need to even hire security. Children were also included in the vaccination requirements in another surprise move that Mr Zara said came without adequate communication or clarity. Bit of a pattern here. We've also received contradictory advice from the department about staff vaccinations and had to correct this advice with our members, causing great confusion and unnecessary further stress, he said. Mr Andrews has previously said vaccine mandates would continue until 2023, but last week said the vaccinated economy would last at least until the Melbourne Formula One Grand Prix in April. On Tuesday, Mr Andrews said he hoped the restrictions would be released sometime in 2022, by which time most people were likely to have had a booster shot of the COVID-19 vaccine as well. And I can see that can being kicked down the road to a few more booster shots. He said he might say more about the timeline for the vaccinated economy when Victoria's numbers reach the mid-90s. Leading pandemic specialists Julie Leask, Catherine Bennett and Tony Blakely argued in The Age on Wednesday that a vaccination rate of 90 or 95% was high enough to protect the state from any increased transmission that might happen if unvaccinated people were given the same rights as those who've had their jabs. Professor Bennett, the epidemiology chair at Deakin University, said the government should end the lockout if cases did not surge as a result of unvaccinated people being allowed into retail outlets, which they have been, between 80 and 90% vaccination rates. As the professor says, going forward, there wouldn't be an epidemiological argument, but there might be in certain circumstances if there was a large surge in infection rates, she said, which we haven't seen. And she is absolutely right here. With the vast majority of the population fully vaccinated, as I am, I got my Pfizer before it was cool and when I actually had the choice to do so. And with young children significantly better off statistically, that's important, than most vaccinated adults. Your children, unvaccinated, are statistically safer from COVID-19 than most vaccinated adults. The only possible argument left for public policymakers is one of fear. But the less we as a society support segregating each other based on vaccination status, the more the Andrews government has to ramp up that fear, which by this stage is pretty much an epidemiological terror campaign that should have wrapped up by last July. So we have therapeutics now that are as effective as the available vaccines. The hospitals haven't even looked like being overwhelmed since Victoria came out of lockdown, and you shouldn't ever be comfortable with the idea that you or your kids will face violence at work because of Victorian government policies designed to make people's lives miserable. There is no more epidemiological justification for these vaccine mandates. It's time to get out of the way and let Victorians get back to work. See you next Saturday, 8 p.m, for the next one.